Hi there, my name is Emily and I am a Research and Education Assistant at Minidoka National Historic Site. Generally, I'm a writer by trade, but I also interpret the history of the Japanese American incarceration for our visitors at the park. So I thought that I would give you some tools to help you tell the story effectively. There will be 3 writer workshops in total, but for this first video I'm going to focus on the misconception and misinformation around the Japanese American incarceration, as well as how we address that in our interpretation at Minidoka. In the National Park Service, interpretation doesn't necessarily mean speaking another language. Interpretation is an approach to communication, one that connects visitors with a resource in a meaningful way. That resource can be natural, like sequoias or bison, or it can be cultural, like Japanese American confinement sites. Because interpretation is rooted in storytelling, it can show up in many different ways. So interpretation programs can be a guided tour, or exhibits you read on a trail, or even a music video for a virtual pilgrimage opening ceremony. Definitely one of the most creative projects I've worked on is an interactive exhibit where you read the diary of a teenage girl as she journals her experiences in camp for 3 years. She's a fictional character, but we researched journal entries and school essays from actual students in camp to make her voice and her concerns and her interests very authentic. So there's a lot of possibilities if you want to tell the story. It doesn't have to be a lecture. Of course, I say that as I begin a lecture. But if you want to get to the creative bits, it's important to do the research first. This is our library collection at Minidoka. It's not complete by any means, but it does have a nice variety of historical accounts, personal writings, graphic narratives, and even special interest topics, so there are plenty of reading materials out there if you want to learn more about this history. I would also recommend looking up Densho online. Densho has some great learning resources, including an encyclopedia and a digital repository, so it's a great place to start your research. There are a lot of misconceptions about the Japanese American incarceration, and a good portion of our interpretation programs is focused on correcting those misconceptions. The introduction alone is the longest segment of our tour for that reason. This is because we want to make sure that visitors are starting off on the right foot before we dive into the camp life experience. Whenever I begin a guided tour, I break down why this history is important. We also provide a broader narrative that doesn't usually make it into the textbooks. For starters, let's answer a simple but important question. So what? In order to make something important to an audience, we should be able to explain why an audience should care about it. I'll list a few reasons on the screen. One good reason is that a minority group of Americans was targeted because of the group's ethnicity, and that never ends well. People of color are often treated as less American or as others, so it's important that we learn about racial issues in our country and how people of color are marginalized. We also share a commonality with those groups, so we need to recognize them as fellow Americans because we're all connected within this country. Another reason why we should care is that the government violated people's civil and constitutional rights. Even if an audience feels like they can't empathize because they aren't personally connected with the Japanese American community, this history can still affect them or someone they care about. A policy that strips away someone's rights can still influence future policies. So even though the country has a general idea that the Japanese American incarceration was a bad thing, politicians in the 21st century have used it as a precedent to propose new laws that would violate the rights of other minorities. The third reason is that this was simply a traumatic event that deeply scarred tens of thousands of people, and hopefully your audience can care about that just as a human rights issue. If your audience doesn't understand the importance of human rights, then that audience probably isn't worth your time and energy. For me, it's a little different because it's my job to talk to people, but it is emotionally exhausting, especially if this is your family history. So remember to practice self-care by setting boundaries for yourself and by giving yourself the space to regularly process your feelings. Okay, so now that we've answered so what, let's get into the basic who, what, when, where, and why. If you learned about the Japanese American incarceration in school, you can probably recite some basic historical facts in the following timeline. On December 7th, 1941, Imperial Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into World War II. Then, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942, and Japanese Americans were excluded from the West Coast and incarcerated in camps. This is pretty much all I got from my high school textbook about this history, so let's break it down and give it some context. Here we have a map of the United States showing where Japanese Americans were excluded from and all of the different detention facilities that they were sent to. The exclusion zone along the West Coast encompasses the state of California and the western parts of Washington, Oregon, and Arizona. Some people lived outside of this exclusion zone and did not have to go to camp, but most Japanese Americans on the U.S. mainland lived within this area and were incarcerated. A lot of people assume that German and Italian Americans were never imprisoned, but that's not quite true. Over 11,000 German Americans and 3,000 Italian Americans were sent to internment camps. Growing up, I had always assumed that Executive Order 9066 specified Japanese Americans, but while it was definitely written with Japanese Americans in mind, it never explicitly names any ethnicity, meaning that it could technically apply to anyone. Basically, Executive Order 9066 gave the Secretary of War and his regional commanders the authorization to establish exclusion zones from which they could remove anyone at their discretion. So on the West Coast, General John L. DeWitt of the Western Defense Command decided to remove Japanese Americans. German and Italian Americans were selected by the Department of Justice for arrest and then given hearings. Altogether, this wasn't a very fair process for them either, but for most Japanese Americans, they weren't ever given any trial or even accused of a crime. Tens of thousands of people were just imprisoned. But what you should take away from this is recognizing that this was a systemic issue. President Roosevelt absolutely failed Japanese Americans, but it went far beyond one individual. The Secretary of War and the Western Defense Commander had the power to handle things differently, but they were actually advocates of the forced removal of Japanese Americans, along with many critical state governors, community leaders, and the media. All these people helped influence the ultimate decision. So let's ask ourselves why Japanese Americans were removed and incarcerated. One of the most common misconceptions about the incarceration is that it was a result of military necessity. When you hear this over and over, you start to think that maybe that's true, which is a really awful feeling if this is part of your family history, because you know that they didn't do anything wrong and that this traumatized them. A lot of visitors tell me that it was a different time back then, or people didn't know any better, but we have critical evidence that shows people knew this was wrong. The US government had been monitoring the Japanese American community since the 1930s, and 2 intelligence reports were submitted within months of Pearl Harbor. These are known as the Munson Report and the Ringel Report. These reports came from the State Department and the Office of Naval Intelligence, and they concluded that the Japanese American community overall did not pose a threat to national security. Military officials who were involved in the investigations on the West Coast opposed the mass removal of Japanese Americans, and they even made recommendations for alternative security plans. Even FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was against the idea, which should say a lot. Now let's fast forward a few decades. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Japanese Americans campaigned for the government to adjust the World War II incarceration. Finally, in the 1980s, a bipartisan federal commission was established to investigate it. This was called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. Ultimately, it found that there was no direct military necessity, and the incarceration was actually the result of racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. In response to the findings of this report, the federal government offered an official apology to the Japanese American community for its wrongdoings. That report is called Personal Justice Denied, and all 3 documents are useful if you want to go straight to the source. You might also be interested in the final report of Lieutenant General DeWitt, since he exposes his own racism toward Japanese Americans. There's also the Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus United States. This case notoriously upheld the forced removal of Japanese Americans, but the 3 dissenting arguments also address the flaws in the military necessity concept. I know I've only skimmed the surface of these topics, but hopefully these documents can help ground you if you weren't familiar with them before. Another important part of interpreting this history is expanding the traditional narrative. As a society, we have a tendency to talk about the Japanese American incarceration as an isolated event, as if it began and ended with the war. But anti-Japanese sentiment began decades before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the impact of the incarceration lasted long after the camps closed. So let's go back to the Commission's report. What did racial prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership actually look like? As I mentioned before, this was a systemic issue. President Roosevelt certainly had the most power, but state governors also actively supported the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and the courts, including the Supreme Court, failed to protect their rights. The concept of war hysteria is a little more nebulous. When I was younger, I got the sense that there's nothing anyone could do about it. Fear is often irrational, and war makes people afraid. But then I found out that influential people had spread false rumors. So while most people were experiencing a genuine fear of an invasion on the West Coast, that fear is also aggravated by newspapers, politicians, and white supremacists who were wrongly claiming that Japanese Americans were supporting the Imperial Japanese military. This is actually a good lesson in vetting our information sources and considering the impact of social power. Think about who has influence over society today. Not only should we hold newspapers, politicians, and celebrities accountable, but also community leaders, large businesses, and online influencers. Are they experts in the relevant field? If not, have they consulted experts or referred to established research? Does their message target anyone who doesn't have socio-political power? We should also think critically about our own habits. Before you share something with a friend or on social media, check its validity first. Is this story true? What are the credentials of the person or people who created the original post? Consider your own biases. Are you ignoring factual research in favor of your own beliefs? Whose voices are you amplifying? Some simple fact-checking can help prevent mass hysteria. When it comes to racial prejudice, I usually provide a summary of pre-war history as a way of setting up the major event. In a narrative arc, you can think of this as building tension. Basically, this gives our audience the context they need to understand that the incarceration didn't happen in a vacuum. But this time, I'm going to address racial prejudice with a slight twist. Racism in America has been closely connected with economics since enslaved people were brought here in 1619. But economic impact is often left out when we talk about racial history, so let's put it back in. Even before Japanese immigrants had a major presence in the United States, Chinese Americans were dealing with the yellow peril stereotype, which could escalate dangerously. Due to racial tensions that largely stem from economic competition with white Americans, Chinese Americans were massacred on several occasions. Chinese laborers were then banned from immigrating to the U.S. in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. 25 years later, a similar ban was written up for Japanese laborers. This was called the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. By 1924, the U.S. had passed an Immigration Act that banned all immigration from Asia. But these weren't the only anti-Asian laws. Japanese immigrants became farmers here, and they were really good at it. They took the leftover land that white farmers considered undesirable, and they ended up producing a significant portion of the crops along the west coast. They even dominated in some crops like strawberries and peppers. So naturally, a bunch of laws were passed to prohibit non-white immigrants, particularly Issei, from owning land. These were called the Alien Lands Laws. And it wasn't just agriculture. People formed anti-Japanese organizations to campaign for immigration restrictions and boycott Asian-owned businesses. Now let's fast forward to the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The West Coast was hysterically fearful of a mainland invasion. As people began to discuss the possibility of forcing out Japanese Americans, farmers, businessmen, and labor unions lobbied politicians to make that happen. They weren't the only ones advocating for forced removal, but it does show some financial motivation behind the incarceration. It also reminds us of the average American's role in this decision. The economic impact of the Japanese American incarceration is often left out of the narrative, but when we talk about racial prejudice, it's important to think of not only those who are disadvantaged by racism, but also those who benefit from it and how they benefit from it. By refocusing the lens to include perpetrators, we can hold people accountable and recognize patterns in the future. A simple way of doing this as a writer is to switch from passive voice to active voice. Notice the difference in saying Japanese Americans were incarcerated versus the U.S. government incarcerated Japanese Americans. Passive voice can be useful if we want to focus the attention on Japanese Americans and what happened to them, but active voice reminds us that this didn't just occur out of thin air. There were many people who bore responsibility in orchestrating these events. The words we choose are really important in shaping an audience's opinion. Terminology is actually a big part of our interpretation at the Japanese American confinement sites. Most people think of them all as internment camps, but internment is actually a euphemistic and inaccurate term for describing sites like Minidoka, Tule Lake, and Manzanar. According to the Geneva Convention, an internment camp is a facility that detains enemy aliens. Of the 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were incarcerated, 2/3 of them were U.S.-born citizens. The Issei generation was barred from citizenship because of racist immigration policies. A law dating back to George Washington's presidency, called the Naturalization Law of 1790, prohibited non-white immigrants from any pathway to citizenship, and this didn't change for Asian immigrants until 1952. Officially, camps like Minidoka were called relocation centers, and they were managed by the WRA, the War Relocation Authority. The U.S. government did have internment camps during World War II, but they were run by the Department of Justice. Internment camps largely held Japanese, German, and Italian nationals who were arrested by the FBI after Pearl Harbor. Although it was still problematic, internment was a different process altogether, and internees were somewhat protected by the Geneva Convention. Camps like Minidoka were simply mass confinement sites that detained anyone of Japanese descent, and they were not held to the same standards. By that very definition, concentration camp is an appropriate term to use here. Even U.S. government and military officials called them concentration camps during World War II, but since the 1940s, the term has had a strong connotation with the Holocaust. In general, Americans tend to know more about the camps in Europe than they do about the ones in their own backyard, so it's important to clarify the differences between the two systems of camps. Unfortunately, Japanese Americans did die in camp and in the post-war years due to suicide or health complications. However, they were not systematically exterminated. The Japanese American Citizens League recommends using the term American concentration camp. But if you need an alternative, you can try using incarceration camp or incarceration site. Confinement site is a bit of an umbrella term for all the different types of facilities. Otherwise, the JACL recommends using illegal detention center. In general, incarceration is recommended over internment, including the derivative incarceree instead of internee, and forced removal is recommended instead of relocation. If you'd like to read more about terminology or want some resources to back you up, the Japanese American Citizens League has a handbook called The Power of Words. There's also the article Words Can Lie or Clarify by Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, as well as a joint statement issued by the Japanese American National Museum and the American Jewish Committee. This joint statement focuses on the use of the term concentration camp in particular. We don't want to conflate the Nazi camps with the American camps, but we also need to make sure that we can recognize a concentration camp when we see one. It's important for the audience to remember that the most extreme examples of injustice are not society's only recognition of injustice. The danger is that we may tolerate other versions of oppression because they seem less horrific. One thing we tried to clarify is that there's a threshold where something becomes wrong. People may try to invalidate a victim's experiences by saying that someone else had it worse or that it's not as bad as it was before. People may try to justify it by saying that they feared the victim or the victim broke the law. But if our society violates someone's civil or human rights, then we've crossed the line. And if a discussion becomes a comparison game that lacks any real concern for the parties involved, then we need to bring the conversation back to a place of empathy. In the next video, I'll talk about how we help our visitors make a connection with this history. But in the meantime, I hope you have a great week, and thanks for watching.